Everyone thinks Alexander the Great had the perfect life, conquered most of the known world by 30, never lost a battle, became a living god to millions. But here's what nobody talks about. His life was absolutely miserable. We're talking about a guy who watched his best friend die in his arms, got stabbed by his own soldiers, and was so paranoid he couldn't trust anyone around him. By the end, he was drinking himself to death in Babylon, completely alone despite ruling over millions. His childhood was a nightmare of political violence and family dysfunction. His empire was falling apart while he was still alive, and his mental health was so shattered that he started believing he was literally the son of Zeus. Today we're diving into why being Alexander the Great actually sucked more than you'd think. Alexander's childhood was filled with violence, political intrigue, and psychological trauma that shaped his entire life. His father, Philip II, was constantly at war and had 7 wives for political reasons, creating a household full of jealousy and backstabbing. His mother, Olympias, was obsessed with snake cults and mystery religions, telling young Alexander that he wasn't Philip's son, but the child of Zeus himself. She kept live snakes in her bedroom and performed bizarre rituals that terrified everybody around her. Philip and Olympias hated each other and used Alexander as a weapon in their marriage war. When Alexander was 16, Philip took a 7th wife named Cleopatra Eurydice, which sent Olympias into a rage. At the wedding feast, Philip's new father-in-law insulted Alexander's legitimacy, calling him a bastard. Alexander threw a cup at the man's head, and Philip drew his sword on his own son. The family was so dysfunctional that when Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding, many people suspected Olympias had arranged it. Alexander witnessed multiple assassination attempts, political executions, and family betrayals before he was even a teenager. He was also forced into an intense education under Aristotle that isolated him from normal childhood experiences. Aristotle filled his head with stories of Achilles and heroic glory, making him obsessed with surpassing the heroes of mythology. This wasn't just a tough upbringing, it was systemic psychological damage. Alexander learned that everyone around him was either a threat or a tool to be used. His mother convinced him he was divine, setting up impossible expectations that would torment him his entire life. He never experienced unconditional love or safety, which explains why he became so paranoid and violent later in life. The constant pressure to prove himself worthy of his legendary status created an insatiable need for conquest that would eventually destroy him. His childhood taught him that family members kill each other, that wives plot against husbands, and that the only way to stay safe is to eliminate threats before they eliminate you. The snake cult rituals and divine parentage claims also planted the seeds of the megalomania that would consume him later on. He grew up believing he was part god, which meant normal human relationships were impossible. How do you make friends when you think you're divine? How do you trust anyone when your own parents used you as a pawn in their war against each other? But the childhood trauma was only the beginning, because once Alexander got power, he spent literally every day of his adult life fighting wars. Alexander literally spent his entire adult life fighting wars, which meant he never had a moment of peace or normalcy. From age 20 to 32, Alexander was either actively fighting battles, marching to the next war, or dealing with rebellions. He fought in over 20 major battles and countless smaller engagements across 3 continents. He was wounded multiple times: arrows through his lung, sword cuts to his head, spear wounds into his thigh, and a near-fatal injury in India where an arrow pierced his breastplate and lung. His soldiers eventually mutinied at the Hyphasis River because they were exhausted from fighting for over a decade and wanted to go home. They had marched over 22,000 miles, fought in deserts, mountains, and jungles, and watched thousands of their friends die. Alexander broke down crying when they refused to continue, begging them to follow him to the ends of the earth. He also had to personally kill people in hand-to-hand combat, including friends who betrayed him. He killed his friend Cleitus with a spear during a drunken argument, then spent days refusing to eat or drink out of guilt. The constant violence meant he could never relax or feel safe. Even during peace negotiations, he wore armor and kept bodyguards nearby. He slept with weapons underneath his pillow and had food tasters to check for poisoning. Every meal, every conversation, every moment of his life was shadowed by the possibility of death. Modern soldiers get PTSD from single deployments. Alexander lived in combat for 12 straight years without a break. He developed severe alcoholism, explosive rage, and paranoid delusions as coping mechanisms. The constant adrenaline and stress hormones were destroying his body and mind. He started believing he was actually the son of Zeus because reality was too brutal to handle. The constant violence turned him into someone who solved every problem with murder. When his horse Bucephalus died, he founded a city in its honor, but when human beings disappointed him, he had them executed. He couldn't form normal relationships because he saw everyone as either an ally in war or an enemy to be eliminated. The stress of command meant every every decision resulted in death. Send troops here, people die. Retreat from there, different people die. He carried the weight of every casualty, every strategic mistake, every moment of suffering his wars caused. The physical wounds healed, but the psychological damage accumulated. By the end, he was having nightmares, panic attacks, and episodes where he couldn't tell reality from hallucination. He would wake up screaming, thinking enemies were in his tent. The paranoia got so bad that he started executing people based on dreams and omens. And that paranoia would end up destroying the few genuine relationships he had left, because Alexander lost everyone he cared about. Alexander's greatest tragedy wasn't dying young. It was watching everyone he loved either die or betray him. His best friend and possible lover Hephaestion died suddenly in Ecbatana, possibly from poisoning or illness. Alexander was so devastated he refused to eat for days and ordered the execution of Hephaestion's doctor for failing to save him. He also had the sacred fire of Ahura Mazda extinguished, something that was only supposed to happen when the king died. He declared Hephaestion a divine hero and ordered cities to worship him. His trusted general Parmenion, who had served his father Philip, was executed on Alexander's orders after Parmenion's son Philotas was involved in a conspiracy. Parmenion had been like a father figure to Alexander, but paranoia made him see betrayal everywhere. He personally killed his friend Cletus during a drunken argument when Cletus criticized his adoption of Persian customs. Cletus had saved Alexander's life at the Battle of Granicus, but that didn't matter when Alexander's rage took over. His mother Olympias was murdered by Cassander after Alexander's death, and she died horribly, stoned to death by families of people she had killed. Even his wife Roxana and infant son Alexander IV were eventually murdered in the power struggles that followed his death. His other wife Satera was also killed by Roxana out of jealousy. Every person he had ever cared about ended up dead, usually violently. This wasn't just bad luck. Alexander's lifestyle made it impossible to maintain relationships. His paranoia meant he saw betrayal everywhere, so he preemptively eliminated threats, including innocent lives. The guilt from killing Cletus haunted him for the rest of his life. He would break down crying whenever someone mentioned his friend's name. His constant traveling meant he could never build a stable home or community. The pressure of ruling such a vast empire meant everyone around him had ulterior motives for gaining his favor. People didn't love Alexander the person. They feared Alexander the king or wanted something from Alexander the Conqueror. He became trapped in a vicious cycle where his power isolated him from genuine human connection, but he couldn't give that power up without losing everything. The death of Hephaestion broke something inside of him that could never heal. Hephaestion was probably the only person who knew Alexander before he became a legend, the only one who could treat him like a normal person. After Hephaestion died, Alexander had no one left who remembered the scared boy from Macedonia. He was surrounded by thousands of people, but completely alone. The isolation drove him deeper into alcohol and paranoid delusions. He started talking to statues and claiming he could communicate with the gods because real human conversation had become impossible. And while Alexander was dealing with all this personal trauma, his empire was actually falling apart around him. While everyone focuses on Alexander's conquests, his empire was actually a disaster that was collapsing even when he was alive. Rebellions were breaking out constantly across his territories. The Greeks revolted while he was in Asia, requiring his general Antipater to put down the uprising. His own Macedonian and Greek soldiers hated serving alongside Persian troops and constantly complained about his adoption of Persian customs. At Opis, his veterans mutinied when he tried to discharge them and replace them with Persian soldiers. The different cultures in his empire refused to integrate despite his efforts to create a unified kingdom. His mass wedding ceremony at Susa, where he married 80 of his officers to Persian noble women, was supposed to unite East and West, but most of the Greek officers abandoned their Persian wives as soon as Alexander died. His generals were already plotting to divide up his territories before he died. They were just waiting for the opportunity. Tax collection was inconsistent and many regions were essentially independent, paying tribute only when Alexander's armies were nearby. He had to constantly march armies around just to maintain basic control, which exhausted his troops and treasury. The logistics of governing such a vast territory were impossible with ancient communication and transportation. Messages took months to travel from one end of the empire to the other, meaning local governors acted independently and often corruptly. His attempts to blend Greek and Persian administrative systems created confusion and resentment on both sides. Alexander had conquered too much too fast without any sustainable system of government. He was trying to personally manage an empire that stretched from Greece to India, an impossible task for one person. Every day brought new crises that required his immediate attention, meaning he could never rest or delegate effectively. The constant stress of preventing total collapse was exhausting him physically and mentally. He knew that the moment he died, everything would fall apart, which is exactly what happened. Within a year of his death, his empire had split into multiple kingdoms ruled by his former generals, who spent the next several several decades fighting each other. The unified world he had dreamed of creating lasted less than a decade. The administrative burden was crushing. He had to manage different legal systems, currencies, languages, and customs across dozens of conquered territories. His attempt to solve this by adopting local customs alienated his Macedonian base while failing to win over conquered peoples who saw him as a foreign occupier regardless of what clothes he was wearing. The empire was held together by nothing but fear of Alexander personally, which meant it was doomed from the start. But even worse than the political pressure was what all the success was doing to his mind. Alexander's final years show a man who had completely lost touch with reality and was spiraling into madness. He started demanding that people worship him as a living god, something that horrified his Greek followers who believed only dead heroes could be deified. He sent letters to Greek cities ordering them to recognize his divinity and build temples in his honor. He adopted Persian customs and dress, wearing the Persian royal robe and requiring visitors to prostrate themselves before him, which his Macedonian veterans saw as betrayal of their culture. He flew into murderous rages over minor slights and executed people for trivial reasons. When someone failed to prostrate properly, he might order their death on the spot. He talked to statues of gods and claimed to receive divine visions and prophecies. His drinking became so severe that it affected his ability to make military decisions. He would pass out during strategy meetings and wake up not remembering what had been discussed. He became obsessed with omens and superstitions, consulting fortune tellers and interpreting every random event as a sign from the gods. He ordered the execution of anyone who questioned his divine status or criticized his policies. Even his closest advisors were afraid to be alone with him because his mood could shift from friendly to homicidal in seconds. He started planning increasingly grandiose and impossible projects, like conquering Arabia and sailing around Africa, as if normal human limitations didn't apply to the guy. This wasn't just arrogance. Alexander was having a complete psychological breakdown. The combination of childhood trauma, constant warfare, substance abuse, isolation, and unlimited power had destroyed his ability to function as a normal human being. He had achieved everything he thought he wanted, but realized it hadn't brought him his happiness or peace. The pressure of maintaining his godlike image while dealing with the very human problems created a cognitive dissonance that shattered his mental health. He couldn't admit weakness or vulnerability because that would undermine his authority, so he had to pretend to be superhuman, even as if he was falling apart on the inside. The alcoholism was both a symptom and a cause of his deterioration. He drank to numb the pain, but the drinking made his paranoia and rage even worse. His divine delusions were a defense mechanism against the unbearable reality that despite all of his power, he couldn't protect the people he loved or create the perfect world he had imagined. The boy who had been told he was the son of Zeus finally started believing it was because the alternative, accepting that he was just a traumatized human being who had caused immense suffering, was too painful to bear. He died at age 32, probably from alcohol poisoning combined with his other health problems, alone and paranoid in a foreign city, surrounded by people who feared him but didn't love him. And that brings us to the final tragedy of this story. Even his death was a disaster. Alexander's death was the final cruel joke in a life full of suffering, and it made everything he had worked for meaningless. He died in Babylon at age 32, probably from a combination of alcohol poisoning, malaria, typhoid fever, and sheer physical exhaustion from years of warfare and drinking. Some sources suggest he was poisoned by his own generals who were tired of his erratic behavior, but most historians think his body simply gave out. He had been drinking heavily at a party thrown by his friend Medius and fell ill with fever and severe abdominal pain. For 11 days, he lingered, unable to speak, while his generals argued over who would succeed him. When asked who should inherit his empire, he allegedly whispered, "The strongest," which guaranteed civil war. He died without naming a clear heir, even though he had an infant son and a pregnant wife. His body was so well preserved by the embalming process that it didn't decay for months, leading to rumors that he wasn't really dead. His empire immediately collapsed into chaos as his generals fought for control. His mother Olympias, wife Roxana, and infant son were all murdered within a few years. The unified world he had dreamed of creating was torn apart by decades of warfare between his successors. The timing and manner of Alexander's death destroyed everything he had worked for. He had spent 12 years conquering the world, but died before he could figure out how to govern it effectively. His failure to plan for succession showed how disconnected he had become from reality. He seemed to think he was immortal despite his obvious health problems. The civil wars that followed his death killed more people than his original conquests and undid most of his cultural achievements. The cities he founded were destroyed, the administrative systems he created collapsed, and the fusion of Greek and Eastern cultures he had promoted was abandoned. The millions of deaths, the destroyed cities, the displaced populations was all for nothing. If he had lived longer and successfully created a stable government, maybe, just maybe, the bloodshed would have been worth it. Instead, his empire became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unlimited ambition. The man who wanted to be remembered as a god became a symbol of how power corrupts and destroys everything it touches. Even his body became a political tool. His generals fought over who got to bury him, and his tomb became a pilgrimage site for other would-be conquerors who didn't learn from his mistakes. When you add it all up, being Alexander Alexander the Great was basically a lifetime of trauma with no payoff. So yeah, Alexander the Great conquered most of the known world, but his life was absolutely miserable. He spent his childhood traumatized by family violence and psychological manipulation, his adult life fighting endless wars that destroyed his mental health, lost everyone he cared about to death or betrayal, watched his empire crumble while he was still alive, and died alone and insane at 32 from alcohol poisoning. Sure, we remember him as one of history's greatest conquerors, but the price he paid was his humanity, his relationships, and ultimately, his sanity. His story isn't really about greatness, it's about how childhood trauma, constant violence, and unlimited power can destroy a person from the inside out. The boy who was told he was the son of Zeus became a man who couldn't trust anyone, couldn't love anyone, and couldn't find peace anywhere. He achieved everything he thought he wanted, but realized too late that conquest doesn't cure loneliness, power doesn't heal trauma, and being worshipped as a god doesn't make you feel human. Sometimes getting everything you think you want is the worst thing that can happen to you. Alexander's story is a warning about the cost of ambition and the danger of believing your own hype. Makes you think twice about whether you'd actually want to trade places with history's most successful people. Turns out being legendary doesn't mean being happy. If you want more stories about why historical figures' lives actually sucked, subscribe and hit the bell.